We're so happy today because we have two spectacular presenters this morning, two professors that I think they're leading the field in two different continents and they have done incredible work. We will have Professor Jonathan Levy, who's joining us this morning to tell us more about intergroup conflict. And also we'll have Agustin Ibanez, we have the luxury of having him today with us. He's one of the lead, I would say, groundbreaking neuroscientists doing public policy across fields. So we are so grateful to have you here. So we're going to start right now with Jonathan Levy. So we just to let you know, we had 560 registered participants from all over the world, and we have participation from the UNDP and Secretary General's office from New York, and also the national government, and we have also the peace builders in the country who have joined us very generously here. So without any more talk on my part, we're gonna give the floor to Professor John Levy to start this conversation today. Professor, please receive our grateful greetings from Bogota.
Hi, thank you. I was hearing just the Spanish, so I'm not sure what you told me. But yeah, thank you. Shall I start? Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. We hear you really good. Please go ahead. Dile a Fabián, por favor, que le diga que si lo oímos bien. Está perfecto.
Okay. I will start. Thank you. Okay, so I will start by saying that I'm very thrilled here. Then really thank you for inviting me. I'm really happy to be here. And I will say just a bit why, because actually Emile Bruno had a lot of influence on my life and on my work, the work that I do, because actually I was a neuroscientist, a cognitive neuroscientist, until I heard about the work of Emile Bruno. And then when I heard about what Emile was doing, so this really inspired me a lot and led me to, in a way, change my career focus in a way that before I was investigating cognitive processes, and then I started to research those questions that about peace and empathy and all these manifestations in the brain. So everything that some of the main things that Emile was also interested in. So I will start, and now I will share the screen. If there is an issue, please let me know. Okay. So yeah, so this, so I will talk about building an empathic brain. I will say what I mean with that. But just first, I would like to say that, as I said, Emile really inspired me a lot, and this eventually led recently to establishing the Empathy Building Neural Lab, which I'm heading here at Aalto University in Finland, in collaboration with Reichman University in Israel, and where we study empathy and empathy deficits between social groups, and how we can use neuroscience and other approaches to promote empathy and to mitigate deficits of empathy. So I'll just start by saying what is empathy. So briefly, empathy, there are three main aspects, components to empathy. So sharing with others' emotions, understanding their mental states, and also wanting to help, to be concerned by them, by their situation, and wanting to help. So this is one aspect. These are three components which are very common in empathy, and of course, depending on the context. So some components are stronger than others. But today I will not talk too much about empathy, but rather about the deficit of empathy. And what is strikingly remarkable is that when it comes to other social groups, we all tend to switch off our empathy. And I really liked what I read about Professor Yitzhak Fried from UCLA, who is a very world-renowned neuroscientist. And I read about this syndrome E, and I will quote what I read about it, and I found that it was um, really reflecting this topic very well. So history shows us the same grim phenomenon over and over under extreme circumstances. Apparently, ordinary citizens turn into merciless torturers and systematic executioners of defenseless victims. War crimes and genocides may be orchestrated by dictators and terrorist leaders, but they are carried out by individuals who otherwise show empathy, sound moral judgment, and aversion to violence. How does this happen? Can the pathological switch between a sensitive human being and desensitized killer be isolated and prevented? So I think this text really captures the issue of intergroup relations and the deficits of empathy. How when it comes to intergroup relation, so often we tend to switch off empathy, and sometimes this can lead to atrocities, as has happened throughout histories, like genocides, etc. So when I first read about Emil's work, so using neuroscience in the service of peace, so I was tremendously inspired to read this pioneering article. So the first one in 2010 was really inspiring for me. And and then I was really interested in how we can suddenly use this neuroscience tool that I've been working with for many years, but this time for something which is so related to our society and to our life, and so much a bit detached from the academia and the things I was studying before, like cognitive processes. So this really inspired me, and the thing is that I really liked these explanations of Emil, how we emphasized about how neuroscience can detect processes that otherwise are difficult to detect in conventional research on intergroup relations. So this really inspired me. And then I also like this strategy of how to do it. So the first strategy that I saw that Emil was emphasizing was first to find the neural markers that are related to deficits of empathy or to prejudice or intergroup bias. And we've been investigating it I've been investigating it with my colleagues and students and collaborators. And today I will talk about one paradigm which I found was really good at to be captured in the neuroimaging experiment. And this is the implicit association test, also called IAT in short. And basically, it reflects some kind of intergroup bias that we have. Some can say it's an implicit prejudice or implicit bias. There are different definitions, but basically what happens is that if you take an in-group and you the assumption is that we automatically assign the in-group with something good and the out-group with something bad. So these are the congruent condition in the experiments that we do. And then there is the incongruent condition, which is the opposite. The in-group is bad and the out-group is good. And what happens when you contrast these two conditions, the incongruent versus the congruent, then you suddenly see some markers in the brain. And today I will first start by showing this. So we conducted this experiment in Israel between Israelis and Palestinian citizens of Israel, and we invited them to conduct this paradigm inside the neuroimaging tool, which is called MEG. And we showed them these paradigms, so they saw names of Palestinians or names of Israeli, and then they were assigned to positive or negative, and based on this incongruent and congruent condition, we could see the bias. And I will next slide I will show the results. But also I want to say that we also used a paradigm which is called active intergroup dialogue. So in this paradigm there were the paradigm is called the intergroup dialogue. And then in this paradigm, there were dyads of Palestinian and Israelis, and they were discussing for 15 minutes. And we were measuring how much they were actively and positively engaged in this dialogue. And in this way, we wanted to see both the neural effects of intergroup bias or prejudice, and also how it connects to real life dialogue. So in our this study that we published last year, we found this very clear signature in the alpha rhythm in the brain. I will not get too much into the details on that, but we found this really nice. So if you can see on the left side of this slide, you see this very dark blue around the number of 10. If you can see, I guess it's too small, but anyway, so this was at around 10 hertz. There was a strong neural rhythmic response, and this was reflecting this intergroup bias or intergroup or implicit prejudice. And then we investigated this effect, and we found that it was anti-correlated with active dialogue. So the more they had bias, the less they were positively engaged in dialogue, and vice versa. The less they had bias, so the participants who had less bias were actually more positively and actively engaged in the dialogue with the other side, the members from the other side of the conflict. So then, and the second step that Emil was emphasizing is not to stop here, not just to say, okay, we found this neural marker for intergroup bias, but he was also saying how it's important to use this bias to evaluate the impact of interventions that can promote peace. So I will now present this second aspect, which inspired me so much, and I will show 4 different interventions that we've been using in the past few years. The first one is based on dialogue. So this is, in other words, it's also can be called the intergroup contact. And this is when the two sides simply meet with each other and have dialogue with each other, learn to know each other. So starting with that, I will describe a study that we conducted together with Ruth Feldman and other colleagues. And this was an intervention to adolescents, and it was an 8-week intervention. The adolescents were meeting with each other, Palestinian citizens of Israel, as well as Israeli youth, were meeting once a week to dialogue with each other. And each session had a different topic, but basically it was about to share, dialogue, get to know each other, and also to talk about sensitive topics like the conflict between the two sides. So in this study, we 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 implemented a meals approach to investigate first, to look at the bias in the brain, the marker that reflects the bias in the brain. This is before the intervention. Then to have the intervention, and then after the intervention, also to again conduct the experiment and to see basically whether the bias changed. And another thing that we added to this study, which we conducted already quite several years ago, was that we then thought to 7 years after, which was last year, we thought to just ask them to send them a survey to see what were their peace attitudes in relation to the conflict. So I will show briefly, basically, without getting into details because of lack of time, I will just say that we found that this alpha signature that I showed as a first step was significantly reduced in the intervention group, but not in the control group. And so this was the finding, as well as we saw that in the interview that we conducted with them, there was also stronger peace support after the intervention. But then the interesting finding, even more interesting finding, and probably with some implications for peace and the impact of this intervention, was that we found that although there was no significant difference between the intervention group and the control group in terms of peace, there was we found that there was a prediction of the neural effect that we found earlier on this peace support that was measured 7 years later. In other words, the individual who had the most effect, as we measured in the brain on intergroup bias, had later an increased peace support for peace in context of the conflict. So then I will move now to the second approach of interventions that I also really like. So this one is based on virtual reality. The idea with virtual reality is two things. First is to use an intervention which is very relatively easy to implement and can be implemented not now inviting people for 8 weeks intervention, but simply just giving them a VR headset and just to show them what we want to show them. So we don't need them to force them or anything, or to convince them. We just show them this thing that virtual reality allows us to show things that in reality we cannot really do. So in a way, it allows us to kind of manipulate reality. That's the concept of the virtual reality. So in one study that we started several years ago in Eran Halperin's lab, and this was led by Yossi Chasson. And so in this study, we took the perspective of the Palestinian and the perspective of Israelis in this scene that we filmed with the real actors that was simulating an encounter between Israeli soldiers and Palestinian passengers. And basically, we wanted to see whether for Israelis that take the perspective of the Palestinians, how would that impact them? And again, just briefly, because lack of time, I would just say that it tended to increase empathic emotions, which mediated a decrease of dehumanization of the Palestinian population. And then another study, again, using the same approach, this time led by Eli Adler, who's a doctoral student with me and with Ran Halperin, and this time with a larger sample, and this allowed us also to look at different ideologies. And there we found an effect of political ideology. It seemed like that looking at the scene from the outgroup perspective yielded an impact among the right-wing participants. And this is very interesting. It suggests that the right-wing participants, this VR intervention that allows them to look at the scene from the outgroup perspective, so they are more influenced by it. And then now a same approach of VR, but this time a completely different VR movie. This one was created. It's called the People to People Initiative, and in this one, it was a peace activist, Palestinian peace activist, sensitively telling about his story, sharing about his life story. And we found also here that it had an effect on the right-wing participants, much more than on the left-wing participants. And our interpretation was that for the left wing, they already had quite empathic and conciliatory attitude levels, and quite relatively high levels, and therefore the effect was not as strong towards them compared to the right-wing participants. So I will skip a couple of slides because of lack of time. And so we had another intervention, this time to tackle political ideology polarization. And this one, I will skip it. I will briefly end with the paradoxical thinking intervention, which I very much like and appreciate. And this was introduced by Boaz Amiri yesterday. So this is Boaz and I. We started to collaborate on this direction quite several years ago, and I really like this paradoxical thinking intervention. And as some of you already know, so the point of the paradoxical thinking intervention is that you're exposed to a message which doesn't contradict your opinions, but it goes in the direction of your opinions, but takes it to the extreme and sometimes a bit absurd. So in this way, it allows people to a bit question or reconsider their attitude. So for instance, in the context of the immigration in the EU, so in this study that was not conducted by myself, but by German researchers in Germany, so they were asked, the participants were asked, why do you think refugees are only coming to Germany to rob everything we have? So most people don't really think that way, and in that way, it allowed the participant to suddenly stop and to say, hey, I didn't really say that, and then to reconsider their attitudes, which were originally quite negative towards immigrants. We also did a study on the attitudes toward people who oppose vaccines during the pandemic, and then also we expose them with information which was also a little bit paradoxical, and we investigated this. Again, we found an effect. I will not get into these details now. And I will just end with this novel approach that we also developed, which is not only to measure the effects before and after the intervention, but also to characterize the neural mechanism operating during the effect of the intervention. And this is a study that I've been conducting together with Boaz. And to give you an example, so this is in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. To give you an example of questions that they were exposed to. So why do you think that the Gaza Strip should be flattened and demolished? So most people don't really think so. And they say, I find it extreme, it's horrible, and then it allows them to reconsider their attitudes. And we found some interesting effects in the brain that during these moments of the influence of the paradoxical thinking, and that this predicts attitude moderation and the sense of confusion during the intervention. So to end, I would say just that my take-home message is that empathy is important, but we should be aware of this intergroup empathy switch that in certain intergroup contexts can make us switch off our empathy towards certain social groups. And using and as I was very much inspired by Emil, to see how neuroimaging can pinpoint neural markers, and then using those markers to design and evaluate interventions that would potentially support peace and moderate interventions, moderate attitudes that can not really support peace. So I acknowledge all those people who are collaborating with me on these works and the funders. And as I said a lot, mainly to Emile Bourneau, who inspired me to begin this exciting scientific path. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to take any questions or discussions if there is enough time to.
Oh, thank you so much, Dr. Levy.